Joan had had a recurring nightmare all her life, and it was always the same. In the nightmare, she would become cold and terrified in her sleep, and would wake up to find a room filled with a silvery-blue light, and standing on the other side of the room, watching her, was an old man dressed in rumpled old-fashioned clothes. The man never moved and would just stare at her from beneath the brim of his hat. The moment Joan saw the man, she would scream and immediately wake up. When she was about 4, her parents had become concerned and decided to consult a pediatrician about her terrifying nightmares. He told them not to worry and that the nightmares would eventually go away, but they did not go away. And when Jo was 8, her parents decided to consult a child psychiatrist. Young Joan visited the psychiatrist every week for a year, but the nightmares continued to haunt her. Unable to cure her of her nighttime terror, he assured her parents that Joan was a healthy and normal child with an overly active imagination, and just like the pediatrician 4 years earlier, told them not to worry and the nightmare would go away in a few years. But that was not to be the case, and when Joan was in her middle teens, the nightmares escalated and were now occurring every 2 weeks. At this stage, Joan and her family had to come to terms with the nocturnal ordeal and had learned to live with it. Strangely, over the years, every time she had the nightmare, the figure of the old man had come progressively closer to her bed and had become so terrifying that the family were forced to seek help from yet another specialist. On this occasion, they administered many tests along with a 6-month course of therapy where they discussed her childhood. Yet again, the psychologist concluded that there was nothing physically wrong with Joan, and she was healthy and not to worry. He assured them it would go away in a few years. When Joan was 20 and was now in college, her roommate became concerned about her terrifying nightmares and suggested she seek urgent counselling at the school. After a few sessions, she was told that she held deep-seated hostilities towards her parents and that the nightmares would go away as soon as she graduated from college and gained independence from her parents. Shortly after marrying at 26, her husband became alarmed by her terrifying nightmares and took her to a psychiatrist who admitted her into a local mental health centre so he could have her evaluated and observed. Joan stayed in the health centre for 3 weeks and was eventually released with a diagnosis of generalised anxiety and prescribed tranquilizers. As with every other visit to a specialist, she was told not to worry and that the nightmares would go away in a few years. As time passed and Joan was now in her 30s, her terrifying nightmares had continued and she had never grown out of them. Obviously hesitant to visit any type of psychiatrist, it was suggested she try hypnosis, where surprisingly none of the many psychiatrists she had visited had ever attempted. By now Joan was desperate and was willing to try anything. Even with a long history of therapy of all kinds, she didn't hesitate to give it a go. At the time of her first visit, where the dreams had gotten worse, the old man across the room was now standing near her bed. But over many years, she had somehow learned to live with her nightmare, but was terrified at what would happen if the man eventually touched her, which she felt would eventually happen. The hypnotist said that it was possible that as a child she may have been abused in some way and the old man was a repressed memory. Joan shrugged off the suggestion and told the hypnotist that her last 3 therapists also believed some type of abuse was the cause and did their best to get her to remember it. However, Joan was willing to see if hypnosis could open any doors and see what might turn up. Fortunately, unlike many patients, Joan went into hypnosis easily and the hypnotist used guided imagery to lead her into a beautiful clearing in the woods. In the clearing, they brought down a white light which surrounded her with calm and safety. Then they asked her to bring the old man into the clearing, which she had had no trouble doing. The old man stood just as he did in her nightmare, with his old-fashioned rumpled clothes, watching her from under his hat, although she could not see his eyes. At the hypnotist's instruction, Joan was asked to look directly into the old man's eyes and asked what he wanted, but he said nothing. Joan said that she felt he wanted something from her. Joan was instructed to ask what it was, but again, after a few moments, he would not reply. He would neither talk to her nor look directly at her, and just stood there. At this point, she was asked if she wanted to explore any childhood experience she might have had with this man, which she agreed to. She was then instructed to calmly go back in time to a point 5 minutes before she had last seen him and expected a memory from her childhood to surface. But in a strange twist, she instead found herself as an adult woman on a rocky hillside watching her little daughter pick wildflowers, and the man was nowhere to be seen. As she was describing the scene, she became confused, as she was wearing a long old-fashioned skirt and her daughter was not her present daughter. It suddenly dawned on the hypnotist that Joan may possibly have slipped into a past life, and she was asked where she was. Joan said, "I think I'm in Spain." She was then instructed to go back to the time when she was a child in that lifetime. Joan now found herself in England, which looked to be in the early 1800s. She was raised in an English seaside town, and when she was 15, her poor and widowed mother arranged a marriage for her to a prosperous local shopkeeper. The man was in his 40s and looked extremely dour, but wealthy. Finally, this was the breakthrough they were looking for, because he was the man in Joan's nightmare. At the start of her marriage, the young girl was entranced by a new home, her new clothes, and status as the wife of a prosperous man, compared to the impoverished life she had left. After a period of time, she found the man was too old and too set in his ways for her. He later admitted that he had only married her because he wanted a housekeeper and a hostess, and a son to inherit his business. Unfortunately, she failed to become pregnant, and he grew distant towards her, and she became lonely and bored. Fishing boats would regularly sail into their village to sell their wares, and she fell in love with a young fisherman from one of the ships, and she ran away with him to his village in Spain, where they pretended to be married. She later gave birth to a baby daughter. Her life in Spain was not particularly happy because the young man, like the other men of the village, would be away for weeks at a time, and the women in the village never accepted her because she was a foreign woman. But she was reasonably content to raise her child and take part in the life of the village, as much as she was allowed to. One day when the young man was away fishing, she and her daughter were gathering wildflowers on a hillside that overlooked the ocean. This was the first scene she'd experienced when they began the session. As her daughter was picking flowers a short distance away, the young woman looked up and saw her real English husband walking up the hillside towards her. His clothes travel-stained and rumpled. He tracked her down and was followed by the women of the village. As he reached her, she was sitting on the ground with the flowers in her lap. He did not utter a word and just stood there staring down at her, and his face was filled with scorn and hatred. Then suddenly he gave her a savage kick, and the women of the village, instead of defending her, joined in and screamed at her and pelted her with rocks. The young woman was stoned to death. The last thing she saw before she died was her husband standing quietly by, watching her writhing body from underneath his lowered-brimmed hat. Her nightmarish dreams were now coming back to life. She could not see his eyes because the silver-blue light of the sun was reflecting off of the sea and was blocking any vision. After they finished exploring this past life, the hypnotist knew that these two people had unfinished business and must forgive each other. The hypnotist instructed Joan to place herself once more in the clearing in the woods that had begun their first session. This time they gave her no white light and instructed her to confront her husband and ask him what he wanted from her. She then asked the old man to come forward, calling him by his name, William. She was crying and asked him what he wanted from her, and this time she got an answer. He said he wanted her back as his wife. With the hypnotist's prompting, she explained to him that their time was long past, that she had moved into another life, and that they must forgive each other so that he could do the same. He seemed to understand, looked at her, took her hands, and spoke to her, agreeing. He then smiled and faded away. After coming out of hypnosis, Joan said she felt lighter and freer than she had ever had before, and that her English husband would not trouble her any longer. Many years after the hypnosis session, Joan reported that she had never had the nightmare again, and wonders where the English husband is now. Sadly, had Joan been treated with past life therapy as a child, it is possible that she would have been saved from a lifetime of nightmares. Is it possible that there are a large number of children suffering from recurring nightmares, such as Joan's, where 1 or 2 short sessions could free the child from whatever unfinished business the past life nightmares represents, and at the same time the child's personality and possible talents would not be threatened?